A millionaire hired a farmer woman for his farm, but when he saw her bracelet, he was completely shocked. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Cotswolds as Alexander Blackwood stood at the window of his study, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea. The sprawling Victorian mansion, Thornfield Hall, cast long shadows across the manicured gardens and the vineyard beyond. At 45, Alexander had achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish in life, everything except what truly mattered. The gentle knock on his study door interrupted his reverie. "Mr. Blackwood, the candidates for the vineyard position have begun to arrive," announced Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper of 15 years. Alexander straightened his bespoke navy suit and adjusted his silk tie. "Very well. Send them in one at a time, please." The morning proceeded with a parade of unremarkable interviews. Alexander had inherited the vineyard from his father 20 years ago and transformed it into one of England's most prestigious wine estates. He needed someone who understood not just the technical aspects of viticulture, but also appreciated the artistry involved in crafting fine wines. By mid-afternoon, his patience was wearing thin. The candidates either lacked experience or seemed more interested in the prestigious position than the actual work involved. He glanced at the next resume on his desk. Emma Laurent, 23, graduated with honors in agricultural science from the University of Bristol. Mrs. Henderson ushered in a young woman with honey blonde hair and striking green eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. She moved with a quiet grace, her slim figure clothed in practical attire suitable for vineyard work. "Please take a seat, Miss Laurent." Alexander gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, trying to maintain his professional demeanor despite an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Blackwood." Emma spoke with quiet confidence. "I've researched your vineyard extensively, and am particularly impressed with your sustainable farming practices." As she discussed her thesis on organic viticulture, Alexander found himself distracted by a delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. His heart nearly stopped. The intricate Celtic knot pattern was identical to one he'd given to Catherine Williams 23 years ago, during that magical summer that had changed his life forever. "That's an interesting bracelet," he commented, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma's hand automatically went to the piece of jewelry. "Oh, this. It's a family heirloom. My mother gave it to me on my 18th birthday. She said it was important to her." Alexander's mind raced with possibilities, but he forced himself to focus on the interview. Emma's knowledge of vineyard management was impressive, and her passion for sustainable agriculture aligned perfectly with his vision for the estate. Yet it was the mysterious bracelet that occupied his thoughts. After she left, Alexander sat in his study, memories of Catherine flooding back. They'd met during his final year at Oxford, where she'd been studying literature. Their romance had been intense but brief, ending when his father had insisted he focus on the family business. Catherine had disappeared from his life entirely, and despite his attempts to find her in those early years, she'd seemed to vanish without a trace. The similarity between Emma's bracelet and Catherine's couldn't be mere coincidence. The design had been custom-made by a small jeweler in Oxford, crafted specifically for Catherine. Alexander had only ever seen one like it. That evening, after the other interviews were complete, Alexander found himself unable to focus on work. He paced his study, pausing occasionally to gaze out at the vineyard, where the last rays of sunlight painted the grapevines in shades of gold. The questions multiplied in his mind. How did Emma come to possess that bracelet? What had happened to Catherine? Why did Emma's features seem so familiar? As darkness fell over Thornfield Hall, Alexander made two decisions. First, he would offer Emma the position. Her qualifications more than justified the choice. Second, he would discreetly investigate the connection between Emma Laurent and Catherine Williams. After 23 years of building his empire in solitude, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Emma Laurent stood in her modest flat in Bristol, hands trembling as she read the email offering her the position at Thornfield Hall Vineyard. Her mother, Catherine, watched from the doorway of their small kitchen, her face pale but determined. "He offered me the job, Mum," Emma announced, her voice wobbling with emotion. "I start next week." Catherine's smile was bittersweet as she lowered herself carefully into a chair. The cancer treatments had taken their toll, but her eyes remained bright with purpose. I always knew you'd succeed, darling. Your agricultural knowledge comes naturally, just like your father's green thumb. Emma sat beside her mother, taking her frail hand. You've never told me much about him. Just that he was your university sweetheart, and that things ended before you knew about me. Catherine touched the silver bracelet on Emma's wrist, identical to the one she kept in her jewelry box. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, love. Alexander Blackwood is a good man. He would have done the right thing if he'd known about you, but I was young and proud. When his father threatened to disinherit him if he didn't focus on the family business, I couldn't bear to be the reason he lost everything. But why send me to work at his vineyard now? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The doctors had given her mother months, not years. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Because every child deserves to know their father, and every father deserves to know their child. I've kept this secret for too long, Emma. Watching you grow into such an amazing young woman, I've seen so much of him in you. Your dedication, your love for the land, even the way you furrow your brow when you're concentrating. Emma had spent years imagining what her father might be like, building a picture from the few details her mother had shared. Now, having met Alexander Blackwood, certain things clicked into place. His green eyes matching her own, the familiar shape of his hands, his intense focus when discussing the vineyard. Does he suspect anything? Emma asked, remembering the way Alexander had stared at her bracelet during the interview. Catherine shook her head. He might recognize the bracelet. He had it specially made for me. But he has no reason to suspect you're his daughter. I never told anyone except your grandmother, and she took the secret to her grave. Rising from her chair, Emma walked to the window, looking out at the city lights of Bristol. Her whole life had been spent in this modest flat with her mother, who'd worked multiple jobs to put her through university. Now everything was about to change. I'm scared, Mum, she admitted. What if he figures it out? What if he's angry about being kept in the dark all these years? Catherine joined her daughter at the window, wrapping her arms around her. Alexander has a good heart, Emma. Yes, he might be hurt and angry at first, but he'll see what I've always seen, a remarkable young woman any father would be proud of. As they stood together, Emma's mind wandered to Thornfield Hall. The magnificent house had taken her breath away, but it was the vineyard that had captured her heart. Row upon row of carefully tended vines, the rich soil, the promise of growth and harvest. It called to something deep within her. I should tell him the truth, Emma said suddenly. It's not fair to take the job under false pretenses. Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand. Give it time, darling. Let him get to know you first. Not as his daughter, but as the capable, intelligent woman you are. The truth will find its way out when the time is right. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Emma sat at their small kitchen table. The job contract spread out before her. She traced her fingers over the elaborate letterhead of Thornfield Hall Vineyard, trying to imagine what her life would be like there. The position offered accommodation on the estate, a small cottage near the vineyard that had once housed the previous vineyard manager. She pulled out her mother's old photo album, finding the single photograph Catherine kept of Alexander from their university days. A young man with her same green eyes smiled at the camera, his arm around a younger version of her mother. They looked so happy, so full of promise. 23 years had passed since that photograph was taken. Now, Emma was about to step into a new chapter of her life, carrying the weight of a secret that could change everything. As she prepared for bed, she touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, the tangible link between her past and her future, between the father she'd never known and the mother who'd sacrificed so much to give her a good life. The cottage exceeded Emma's expectations. Nestled among ancient oak trees at the edge of the vineyard, the stone building looked like something from a fairy tale, with its climbing roses and slate roof. Mrs. Henderson had ensured everything was pristine for her arrival, from the freshly laundered curtains to the welcome basket of local produce on the kitchen counter. The previous vineyard manager lived here for 30 years, Mrs. Henderson explained, handing Emma the keys. Mr. Blackwood had it renovated last month. The Wi-Fi password is on the fridge, and I've left my number if you need anything. Emma thanked the housekeeper, watching her disappear down the gravel path before stepping into what would be her new home. The cottage's interior was a perfect blend of traditional charm and modern comfort, with exposed wooden beams and updated appliances. Through the kitchen window, she could see the endless rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Settled in? Remember your first day is tomorrow. Get some rest, darling. So proud of you." X. Emma's throat tightened. Her mother had insisted on staying in Bristol, claiming she needed to continue her treatment routine at the local hospital. They both knew the real reason. Catherine wasn't ready to face Alexander yet. The next morning, Emma arrived at the main house precisely at 7. Alexander was waiting in the courtyard, dressed more casually than during the interview in khakis and a white linen shirt, but still managing to look impeccably polished. "Good morning, Miss Laurent. Ready to begin?" "Please, call me Emma," she said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the vineyard. For the next few hours, Alexander gave her a comprehensive tour of the estate. Emma was impressed by his knowledge and passion for viticulture. He spoke about each grape variety with the tenderness of a parent discussing their children, explaining the unique characteristics of their soil and microclimate. "The thing about wine," Alexander explained as they paused between rows of Chardonnay vines, "is that it's about patience. You can't rush perfection. Each vintage tells the story of its year, the spring rains, the summer sun, the autumn mists. Rather like people, wouldn't you say?" Emma caught her breath at the philosophical turn. "Yes, I suppose we're all shaped by our circumstances and seasons." Alexander gave her a curious look. "You remind me of someone I knew long ago." She had the same way of finding deeper meaning in simple things. Their eyes met briefly before Emma looked away, her heart pounding. Did he suspect? But Alexander merely continued walking, pointing out the irrigation system and explaining their organic farming practices. By midday, Emma's head was swimming with information about pH levels, pruning techniques, and harvest schedules. They stopped at a restored barn that had been converted into the wine production facility. The enormous steel tanks gleamed in the sunlight streaming through high windows. "This is where the real magic happens," Alexander said, leading her through the facility. "We'll begin harvesting in about 6 weeks. Until then, your primary focus will be monitoring the grapes' development and managing the vineyard team." Emma nodded, already formulating plans and improvements in her mind. "I noticed some signs of downy mildew in the lower field. Have you considered using copper-free alternatives for prevention?" Alexander's eyebrows rose with interest. "You noticed that already? I'd love to hear your thoughts on alternative treatments." As they discussed various organic farming methods, Emma felt increasingly comfortable in Alexander's presence. There was something familiar in the way he gestured while speaking, in his thoughtful pauses before answering questions. Mannerisms she recognized from herself. Later that afternoon, alone in her cottage, Emma called her mother. "The first day went well," she reported. "He's exactly as you described him, passionate about the vineyard, kind but reserved." Catherine's voice was weak but happy. "I'm glad, darling. Give it time. Let him see the real you." After hanging up, Emma sat on her small porch, watching the sunset paint the vineyard in shades of purple and gold. A fox darted between the rows of vines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl began its evening song. This place already felt like home in a way she couldn't explain. Inside her cottage, she unpacked the last of her boxes, carefully arranging her books and personal items. The silver bracelet caught the lamplight as she reached for a photo frame, and she paused, studying its intricate pattern. Somewhere in this very house, her father was probably settling in for the evening, unaware that his daughter was living just a few hundred meters away. Alexander sat in his study, a glass of his finest Pinot Noir untouched before him. The evening light was fading, but he hadn't bothered to turn on the lamps. His laptop screen glowed with the results of his discreet investigation into Emma Laurent's background. The facts were straightforward enough. Born in Bristol Royal Infirmary, raised by a single mother, excellent academic record, summer internships at various vineyards across Europe. But it was the timing that haunted him. Emma's birth date was exactly 8 months after Catherine had disappeared from his life. He pulled out an old photograph from his desk drawer, himself and Catherine at a May ball, both laughing at some forgotten joke. The silver bracelet, clearly visible on her wrist, caught the camera's flash. The same bracelet that now adorned his new vineyard manager's wrist. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, hastily returning the photograph to its drawer. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a tea tray. "Thought you might need this, sir." You've barely eaten today." She paused, arranging the cups with practiced efficiency. "The new girl seems to be settling in well. Quite talented, from what the vineyard staff are saying." "Yes, she is," Alexander agreed, accepting a cup of tea. "Mrs. Henderson, you've been with us since my father's time. Do you remember Catherine Williams?" The housekeeper's hands stilled momentarily. "The young lady from your university days, of course. Lovely girl she was. Always had a kind word for everyone. Have you noticed anything familiar about Miss Laurent?" Mrs. Henderson met his gaze steadily. "I wondered if you'd see it too, sir. She has your eyes, if you don't mind me saying, and when she smiles, well, it's rather like looking at a photograph from 20 years ago." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window. The lights were on in Emma's cottage, a warm glow in the gathering dusk. "Why wouldn't Catherine tell me?" he whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Henderson. "Perhaps, sir, there were reasons we don't understand. Your father was quite formidable in those days." Alexander remembered all too well. His father had threatened to cut him off completely if he didn't focus on the family business. He'd chosen the vineyard over Catherine, believing she would understand, believing they would find a way to be together eventually. But she had vanished, leaving only a brief note about needing to find her own path. "I need to know for certain," he said firmly, "but I can't just ask her outright. If I'm wrong—" "If I may suggest, sir," Mrs. Henderson ventured, "give it time. Watch, listen. The truth has a way of revealing itself." After the housekeeper left, Alexander opened his laptop again, searching for any information about Catherine Williams. There wasn't much. She had become a teacher, apparently, at a secondary school in Bristol. No marriage records, no other children. He clicked through to Emma's social media profiles. There weren't many personal photos, mostly landscapes and vineyard shots from her internships. But one image made him pause. Emma at her university graduation, standing beside a woman whose face he would know anywhere. Catherine looked older, of course, but still beautiful. And thin, too thin, he thought with sudden concern. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that both thrilled and terrified him. If Emma was indeed his daughter, why had she come to work for him now? Why had Catherine finally decided to break her silence after all these years? He opened his email, composing a message to his private investigator in London. He needed to know everything. Catherine's current situation, Emma's full background, any connection between them and his family that might explain this sudden appearance in his life. As he typed, guilt gnawed at him. Emma had proven herself more than capable in her first week at the vineyard. The staff respected her knowledge and work ethic. She had already implemented several improvements to their cultivation methods. Did he have the right to investigate her private life simply because of a suspicion? But the alternative, doing nothing, saying nothing, potentially letting his own daughter work for him as an employee while he pretended not to notice the striking similarities, seemed impossible. He closed his laptop without sending the email. Tomorrow, he decided, he would invite Emma to dinner at the main house. Perhaps in a more relaxed setting, away from the business of the vineyard, he might find some answers, or at least begin to know the remarkable young woman who might be his daughter. The invitation to dinner caught Emma off guard. She'd been in the middle of inspecting the irrigation system when Mrs. Henderson delivered Alexander's message, requesting her presence at the main house that evening at 7. "Formal or informal?" Emma asked, wiping soil from her hands. "Smart casual, Mrs." Henderson replied with a knowing smile. "Mr. Blackwood prefers a relaxed atmosphere for private dinners." In her cottage, Emma stood before her wardrobe, phone pressed to her ear. "What do you think it means, Mum? Why would he invite me to dinner?" Catherine's voice crackled through the speaker, weaker than usual. "Perhaps he simply wants to know his vineyard manager better, darling. Remember, he's known for being personally involved in every aspect of the estate." Emma finally settled on a sage green dress that brought out her eyes. His eyes, though he didn't know it yet. She touched the silver bracelet, now a comforting weight on her wrist, and thought about how its twin sat in her mother's jewelry box back in Bristol. The main house was transformed in the evening light, golden sunbeams streaming through tall windows and casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. Alexander welcomed her in the informal dining room, where the table was set for two beside French doors opening onto a terrace. "I hope you like lamb," he said, pulling out her chair. "Mrs. Henderson's rack of lamb is somewhat legendary in these parts. The wine he'd selected was from their own vineyard, a complex Pinot Noir that Emma recognized from her research. 2001, Alexander explained, pouring. The year we won our first international award, also, unless I'm mistaken, the year you were born. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. Yes, that's right. September 4th. Alexander's expression remained carefully neutral, but she noticed his grip tighten on the wine bottle. Tell me about your mother, Emma. It couldn't have been easy, raising you alone. She's the strongest person I know, Emma replied honestly. She worked as a teacher, took extra tutoring jobs to put me through university. She always made sure I had everything I needed, even if it meant going without herself. And your father? Emma met his gaze steadily. I never knew him. Mom doesn't talk about him much, just that he was her university sweetheart, and things ended before she knew about me. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Alexander stood abruptly, walking to the terrace doors. Your mother's name wouldn't happen to be Catherine Williams, would it? Emma's heart stopped. This was the moment, she realized. Everything would change with her next words. Yes, she whispered. Yes, it is. Alexander turned back to face her, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. I recognized the bracelet during your interview. I had it made for her, you see. There was only ever one like it, until now. She gave it to me on my 18th birthday, Emma explained, touching the silver links. She said it was important to her, but I never knew why until she told me about you last month. Last month? Alexander's voice was hoarse. Why now, after all these years? Emma felt tears welling in her eyes. Because she's ill, Mr. Blackwood, very ill, and she didn't want to... She wanted me to know my father before... She couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling out a chair beside her. Emma, please look at me. When she did, he continued softly, You have my eyes. I've been trying to convince myself it was a coincidence, but you have my mother's smile too. I see her in you every time you talk about the vineyard with such passion. I'm sorry, Emma burst out. I'm sorry we deceived you. I wanted to tell you straight away, but Mum insisted we wait. She wanted you to get to know me first, to judge me on my own merits rather than out of obligation. Oh, my dear girl, Alexander's voice broke. The only thing I'm sorry about is the 23 years I've missed. Though I must say your mother did an extraordinary job raising you. Tears were flowing freely now from both their eyes. Alexander reached out hesitantly, taking Emma's hand in his. Will you tell me everything? About your childhood, your dreams, what makes you laugh? I want to know it all. And so, as the summer evening faded into night, father and daughter began to bridge the gap of 23 years. Mrs. Henderson discreetly brought coffee and dessert, pretending not to notice their tear-stained faces or clasped hands. The terrace doors remained open, carrying in the scent of roses and the distant sound of nightingales. The days following the revelation took on a dreamlike quality. Emma continued her work at the vineyard, but now her conversations with Alexander were peppered with personal questions and shared discoveries. They found they had the same allergies to strawberries, the same habit of humming while concentrating, the same terrible handwriting. One morning, as they walked through the lower fields discussing crop rotation, Alexander's phone rang. Emma recognized her mother's number on the screen before he answered. Catherine, he said softly, years of emotion packed into those 3 syllables. Yes. We've talked. Yes, I know everything. He listened for a moment, then looked at Emma. Would you like to speak with her? Emma took the phone, walking a few steps away for privacy. Mum, are you all right? You sound tired. The doctors want to try a new treatment, Catherine explained, but I needed to talk to Alexander first, to explain everything properly. Later that evening, Alexander knocked on Emma's cottage door. His face was grave. Your mother told me about her condition. Why didn't you say how serious it was? Emma busied herself making tea, fighting back tears. She didn't want anyone's pity. She's always been like that, putting on a brave face, handling everything alone. She's not alone anymore, Alexander said firmly. Neither of you are. I've made some calls. There's a specialist in London who's having remarkable success with new treatments. I'd like your mother to come here, to let us take care of her while she undergoes treatment. Emma's hands shook as she set down the teacups. She won't accept charity. It's not charity, Emma. It's family. Alexander ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. I lost 23 years with both of you because of pride and misunderstanding. I won't lose any more time. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander converted a ground-floor suite in the main house into a comfortable apartment for Catherine. Mrs. Henderson supervised the installation of medical equipment and accessibility features, while Emma divided her time between vineyard duties and preparing for her mother's arrival. When Catherine finally arrived, she was even frailer than Emma remembered, but her eyes lit up at the sight of Alexander waiting in the doorway. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. Two people who had loved and lost and found each other again in the autumn of their story. "You haven't changed a bit," Catherine said softly. Alexander smiled, though his eyes were bright with tears. "Liar. I've gone quite grey." "It suits you." Catherine turned to Emma, who was hovering anxiously nearby. "Darling, would you give us a moment?" Emma retreated to her cottage, leaving her parents to reconnect in private. Through her window, she could see the lights of the main house glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in there, 2 decades of secrets and longing were finally being addressed. Later that night, Alexander found her sitting on her porch, stargazing. "Your mother told me everything," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "about how my father threatened to ruin her career in academia if she told me about the pregnancy. About how she chose to leave rather than force me to choose between my family obligations and her. She never wanted you to feel trapped," Emma explained. "She said you had so many dreams for the vineyard, and a baby would have changed everything. She was right, a baby did change everything. I just didn't know it at the time." Alexander reached for her hand. "But now we have a chance to be a proper family, whatever time we have left." The harvest season arrived at Thornfield Hall with golden mornings and crisp afternoons. Emma found herself settling into a new routine. Early mornings in the vineyard, afternoons split between administrative duties and spending time with her mother, and evenings often shared with both her parents in the main house's cozy library. Catherine's strength seemed to rally in the peaceful countryside setting. Though still frail, she had begun taking short walks in the garden, supported by Alexander or Emma. The specialist from London visited weekly, expressing cautious optimism about her response to the new treatment protocol. One particularly fine September morning, Emma was supervising the harvest when Alexander joined her among the vines. He watched with evident pride as she directed the picking crews, her expertise clear in every instruction she gave. "You know," he said, sampling a perfectly ripe grape, "I've been thinking about the future of the estate." Emma wiped her brow, turning to face him. "Oh? The vineyard's just the beginning. This land has so much potential. Your mother mentioned you used to teach art classes to underprivileged children during university." Emma nodded, remembering the community centre in Bristol where she'd volunteered. "It was just something I did on weekends. Mom always said education was the greatest gift we could give others." "She's right." Alexander gestured toward an old stone barn at the edge of the property. "That building's been empty for years. I was thinking it could be converted into something more purposeful. Perhaps an educational centre. Art classes, viticulture workshops, that sort of thing." Emma's heart leapt at the possibility. "You'd really consider that?" "Consider it? I've already had architects draw up preliminary plans." He pulled out a folder from his leather messenger bag. "I'd like you to oversee the project, not just the vineyard manager anymore, but Director of Education and Sustainable Development for the entire estate." Emma's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The plans were beautiful. Light-filled studios, classroom spaces, a demonstration vineyard for teaching sustainable farming practices. "This is incredible. But can we manage both this and the vineyard?" "That's the other thing I wanted to discuss." Alexander looked slightly nervous. "I've been talking with your mother about making things official. A formal recognition of paternity, putting your name on the estate documents, making you my legal heir." Emma stared at him, overwhelmed. A month ago, she'd been simply the new vineyard manager. Now she was standing in the morning sun with her father, discussing inheritance and future legacies. "The truth is," Alexander continued softly, "I'm not getting any younger. This place needs fresh vision, new energy. You've already proven yourself more than capable. The staff respects you, the harvest numbers are better than ever, and your ideas about sustainable practices are exactly what we need for the future." Before Emma could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared between the rows of vines. "Pardon the interruption, But Miss Catherine is asking for you both. She's in the garden room." They found Catherine seated in her favorite sunlit corner, a sketchbook open on her lap. She'd been drawing more lately, returning to the art she'd loved in her university days. Today, however, she wasn't drawing. Instead, she was looking through an old leather-bound album. "I thought it was time we shared this," she said as they entered. "Emma, darling, these are all the letters I wrote to your father over the years. I never sent them, but I kept them along with every photograph, every news clipping about the vineyard's success, every little milestone in your life." Alexander sat beside her on the small sofa, while Emma perched on the ottoman at their feet. Together they turned the pages. Emma's first steps, school awards, newspaper clippings of Alexander's wine competitions, pressed flowers from significant moments, Catherine's unsent letters marking birthdays and Christmases and quiet achievements. "I never stopped loving either of you," Catherine admitted, her voice thick with emotion, "even when I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away." Alexander took her hand, pressing it gently. "The past is past. What matters is now, and the future we can build together." The local farmers' market had been Emma's idea. With the harvest in full swing, she suggested they set up a stall to sell their table wines and showcase plans for the educational center. Alexander readily agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to connect with the community. Emma was arranging their display early one Saturday morning when she noticed a woman at the neighboring stall struggling with her setup. "Let me help you with that," she offered, steadying the wobbling table. "Oh, thank you." The woman smiled warmly. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with auburn hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "I'm Claire Bennett. I run the local bakery." "Emma Laurent," she introduced herself, admiring Claire's array of artisanal breads and pastries. "Those look amazing." "Family recipes, mostly," Claire explained. "I learned from my grandmother. The restaurant's been in our family for 3 generations." As the morning progressed, Emma found herself drawn into easy conversation with Claire during quiet moments. The baker had a way of making everyone feel instantly comfortable, sharing stories about local history and offering practical advice about living in the area. Around midday, Alexander stopped by to check on the stall. Emma noticed immediately how he faltered slightly upon seeing Claire, and how Claire's cheeks flushed pink as she greeted him. "Mr. Blackwood, I haven't seen you at the restaurant in ages." "Please, it's Alexander," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Emma had come to recognize as nervousness. "I've been rather busy lately." "So I've heard," Claire smiled. "The whole village is talking about your plans for the educational center. It's exactly what this community needs." Emma watched their interaction with growing interest. There was clearly some history there, though neither seemed entirely comfortable acknowledging it. Later, as they packed up the stall, Emma couldn't resist asking, "So how do you know Claire?" Alexander busied himself with the wine boxes. "Her restaurant is the best in the area. I used to dine there regularly before." He trailed off, and Emma understood he meant before finding out about her and Catherine. "She seems lovely," Emma ventured carefully. "She is," Alexander agreed softly. "She was very kind to me during some lonely years, but I never allowed myself to—" He shook his head. "It didn't seem right, starting something when I had so many unresolved feelings about the past." That evening, Emma related the market encounter to her mother, who was having one of her better days and had joined them for dinner in the main dining room. "Claire Bennett?" Catherine's eyes sparkled with interest. "I remember reading about her restaurant in the local paper. She won some prestigious awards last year." "She did," Alexander confirmed. "She's transformed her family's old tea room into something quite remarkable." Catherine studied him thoughtfully. "You know, Alexander, it's all right to be happy, to find love again." "Catherine," he began, but she held up a hand. "I mean it. We had our time, and it gave us Emma, which makes it precious beyond measure. But that doesn't mean you have to spend the rest of your life alone." Emma watched her father's face carefully, seeing the conflict there. "Mum's right," she said gently. "You deserve happiness too." Later that night, unable to sleep, Emma walked down to the kitchen for some tea. She found Alexander there, staring out the window at the moonlit vineyard. "I loved your mother very deeply," he said without turning around. "Part of me always will." "I know," Emma replied, putting the kettle on. "But Mum's right. Life goes on. Love grows in new ways. Claire used to leave fresh bread on my doorstep, he admitted quietly. Every Sunday morning, without fail. She never said anything about it, never asked for acknowledgement. She just cared from a distance. Emma smiled, remembering similar stories about her mother leaving anonymous care packages for struggling students. Seems like you have a type, she teased gently. Kind women who show love through small acts of care. Alexander finally turned from the window, accepting the cup of tea she offered. When did you get so wise? I had good teachers, Emma replied. A mother who taught me about unconditional love, and a father who showed me it's never too late to open your heart to new possibilities. October painted the vineyard in rich autumn colors as the last of the harvest was brought in. The conversion of the old stone barn into the educational center was well underway, with builders working steadily to meet the spring opening deadline. Emma had thrown herself into the project, expanding the original plans to include a teaching kitchen where Claire had offered to give traditional baking workshops. The baker had become a regular visitor to Thornfield Hall, initially under the pretext of discussing the workshop curriculum, but increasingly just to spend time with the family. Catherine, particularly, had taken to her immediately. She grounds him, Catherine observed to Emma one afternoon as they watched Alexander and Claire walking in the garden. Look how relaxed he is with her. Indeed, Alexander seemed years younger when Claire was around, his usual reserved manner giving way to easy laughter and warm smiles. For her part, Claire had a way of anticipating his needs before he voiced them, whether it was having his favorite sourdough ready for breakfast meetings or knowing when to simply sit quietly with him after a challenging day. Emma was in her office reviewing construction plans when Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door. Miss Emma, your mother's asking for you. She's in the conservatory with Mr. Blackwood and Miss Bennet. The conservatory had become Catherine's favorite room, filled with potted herbs and flowering plants that Claire had brought to brighten the space. Emma found them all there, her mother in her comfortable chair, Alexander and Claire seated nearby, a tea service spread out before them. Perfect timing, darling, Catherine smiled. We're having a family discussion. Emma's heart warmed at how naturally her mother included Claire in the word family. She took a seat as her mother continued. I've been thinking about the educational center. I'd like to contribute something. Mum, you don't have to. Let me finish, dear. Before I was a teacher, I was an artist. Not many people know this, but I've kept painting all these years. Small pieces mostly, but it helped me through the difficult times. She gestured to a portfolio beside her chair. I'd like to donate my collection to the center, and perhaps, when I'm feeling stronger, teach some classes. Alexander reached for Catherine's hand, squeezing it gently. We'd be honored, but are you sure you're up to teaching? The doctors say the new treatment is working better than expected, Catherine replied. I'm not planning on running marathons, but a few art classes. Yes, I think I can manage that. Claire leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. What if we combined our classes sometimes? Art and baking. I've always thought there's an art to creating beautiful pastries. The conversation flowed easily as they discussed possibilities for the center. Emma watched her parents and Claire, marveling at how naturally they'd become a unit. There was no awkwardness, no tension, just three adults who genuinely cared for each other, each secure in their unique role in this unconventional family. Later that evening, Emma found Alexander in his study, reviewing the day's wine orders. You know, she said, perching on the edge of his desk, you shouldn't keep Claire waiting too long. He looked up, startled. What do you mean? Dad, Emma said, the word still new and wonderful on her tongue. Anyone can see how you feel about each other. You're not betraying Mum by being happy. Alexander set down his papers, considering her words. Your mother said something similar last week. She told me life's too short to waste time on hesitation when your heart knows what it wants. Smart woman, my mum, Emma grinned. So what are you going to do about it? Instead of answering directly, Alexander opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Emma gasped softly at the delicate ring inside, a simple sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. It's beautiful. Do you think it's too soon? Alexander asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. The last thing I want to do is upset the balance we've found. I think, Emma said carefully, that love isn't about perfect timing. It's about perfect understanding. And Claire understands you, understands us, in a way that makes everything feel right. Alexander closed the ring box, returning it to his pocket rather than the drawer. Perhaps I'll invite her to dinner tomorrow night, just the two of us. Good idea, Emma smiled, standing to leave. At the door, she turned back. Dad, I'm really happy for you. His answering smile was bright enough to light up the darkening room. Thank you, sweetheart, for everything. The evening of Alexander's dinner with Claire arrived with a perfect autumn sunset. Emma and Catherine had conspired with Mrs. Henderson to transform the terrace into a romantic setting, with twinkling lights and candles creating a magical atmosphere. Everything's ready, Emma reported to her father, finding him in his dressing room adjusting his tie for the third time. The wine's breathing, the special menu Claire loves is prepared, and Mum and I are going to the cottage for a girls' night in. Alexander turned from the mirror, his expression a mixture of nervousness and joy. When did I get lucky enough to have such a wonderful family? I'd say about 23 years ago, Emma teased, straightening his tie. Though it took us a while to find each other. Down in the kitchen, Mrs. Henderson was putting the finishing touches on the meal when Claire arrived. Emma watched from the hallway as her father greeted Claire with a kiss on the cheek, noting how naturally they moved together, how their hands found each other without conscious thought. "Shall we?" she heard Alexander say, leading Claire toward the terrace. Emma slipped away to her mother's apartment, where Catherine was already settled on the sofa, with a stack of movies and a bowl of popcorn. "Operation Romance is officially underway," Emma reported, curling up beside her mother. "About time," Catherine smiled. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at her. Not even me," she added softly. "Mum, no, darling, it's a good thing. What Alexander and I had was beautiful, and it gave us you. But what he has with Claire is different. It's mature, settled, built on who they are now rather than who they were trying to become." They watched their chosen movie, but Emma found her thoughts drifting to the scene playing out on the terrace. Would her father have found the courage to propose? Would Claire say yes? How would this change their already evolving family dynamic? Around midnight, Emma walked back to her cottage, taking the path that gave her a view of the terrace. The lights were still twinkling, and she could see two figures standing close together near the balustrade. As she watched, Alexander dropped to one knee, and even from a distance, Claire's joyful response was clear. The next morning, Emma arrived at the main house to find Claire and Alexander in the kitchen. Claire's new ring catching the early sunlight as she helped Mrs. Henderson with breakfast. The happiness radiating from them was almost tangible. "So," Emma said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Henderson, "I take it we have something to celebrate?" Claire's smile was radiant as she held out her hand to show the ring. "Your father can be quite persuasive when he wants to be." "He had help," Alexander admitted, wrapping an arm around his fiancée's waist. "Our daughter is quite the matchmaker." The casual way he included both Emma and Claire in the family unit made Emma's heart swell. She was about to respond when Catherine appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily with her walking stick. "I thought I heard happy voices," she said, making her way to the table. "Claire, dear, let me see this ring properly." As Claire extended her hand, Catherine's smile was genuine and warm. "It suits you perfectly. Now, when shall we start planning the wedding?" "I have some ideas for the venue." Emma sat back, watching her mother and future stepmother dive into wedding discussions while her father looked on with amused affection. This, she realized, was what healing looked like. Not the absence of past pain, but the courage to build something new and beautiful from it. Later in the vineyard, Emma stood among the now bare vines, thinking about cycles and seasons. The grapes had been harvested, their juice now fermenting in tanks, slowly transforming into wine. The educational center was taking shape, its walls rising steadily, and her family, once fractured by time and circumstance, had grown in unexpected and wonderful ways. Alexander found her there, 2 cups of tea in hand. "Penny, for your thoughts." "Just thinking about transformation," she replied, accepting the tea. "How things change and grow and become something new without losing what made them special in the first place." "Rather like families," he observed. "Rather like families," Emma agreed, linking her arm through his as they walked back toward the house, where Claire and Catherine's laughter drifted out through open windows. The educational center opened its doors on a bright April morning, just as the first buds were appearing on the grapevines. Emma stood before the restored stone building, now transformed into a light-filled space of learning and creativity, hardly believing how much had changed in less than a year. Catherine, looking stronger than she had in months, sat in her wheelchair beside the entrance, greeting arriving guests. The new treatment had worked better than anyone had dared hope, giving her precious time to see her dreams for the center become reality. Her artwork lined the main hall, landscapes, portraits, and abstract pieces that told the story of her life's journey. "Ready for the grand opening?" Alexander asked, joining Emma on the steps. He looked dashing in his tailored suit, the father she'd once only dreamed of knowing, now a constant, loving presence in her life. "Almost," Emma replied, adjusting the ribbon for the cutting ceremony. "Claire's just finishing the setup in the teaching kitchen." As if summoned by her name, Claire emerged from the building, flour dusting her apron despite her best efforts to stay clean. "The demonstration bread is in the oven, and the students' workstations are ready," she reported, accepting a quick kiss from Alexander before hurrying back inside. The courtyard gradually filled with local residents, press, and prospective students. Emma watched as families explored the facilities, the art studios with Catherine's paintings, the demonstration vineyard where sustainable farming techniques would be taught, the teaching kitchen where Claire would share generations of family recipes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began his opening speech, "welcome to the Thornfield Hall Educational Center. This project represents more than just a new building or a new venture. It represents the power of family, of second chances, and of dreams that refuse to die." He gestured to Catherine and Emma. "My daughter and her mother showed me that it's never too late to rebuild what was lost. They taught me that family can grow in unexpected ways, that love multiplies rather than divides when we open our hearts to new possibilities." Emma felt tears welling up as she watched her father speak. Beside her, Catherine reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. They'd come so far from those first uncertain days at Thornfield Hall. The ceremony continued with Catherine cutting the ribbon, her hands steady as she officially opened the center that would carry her artistic legacy forward. Students began filing in for the first demonstrations. Claire's bread-making class in the teaching kitchen, Catherine's watercolor workshop in the art studio, and Emma's introduction to sustainable viticulture in the demonstration vineyard. Later that afternoon, as the early spring sunset painted the sky in soft pastels, the family gathered in the center's courtyard. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with a celebration feast, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. "I have something for you," Catherine said to Emma, producing a small package. Inside was a silver bracelet, identical to the one Emma wore. "I thought it was time Claire had one too, to complete the circle, so to speak." Claire's eyes glistened as she accepted the gift, understanding its significance. "Thank you, Catherine. This means more than I can say." "Family isn't just about blood," Catherine replied, watching as Alexander helped Claire fasten the bracelet. "It's about love and choice, and the courage to keep our hearts open to new possibilities." Emma looked around at her family, her father and his fiancée, her mother surrounded by her artwork, Mrs. Henderson fussing over the celebration feast, the ancient walls of Thornfield Hall standing guard over them all. The educational center hummed with activity, already fulfilling its promise of bringing new life and learning to the community. As the evening wore on, students and guests began to depart, but the family lingered in the courtyard, reluctant to let the magical day end. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing. "Your grandmother would have loved this," Alexander said softly to Emma. "She always said Thornfield Hall needed more laughter, more life, more love." "She was right," Emma agreed, watching as Claire showed Catherine her grandmother's secret recipe for celebration bread. The two women bent together over the handwritten notes. "And now it has all three." The wedding took place in the vineyard at midsummer, with rows of flowering lavender lending their fragrance to the evening air. Lights twinkled in the ancient oak trees, and tables laden with Claire's artisanal breads and local delicacies dotted the lawn. Emma helped Claire prepare in the bridal suite, where Catherine had insisted on doing the bride's makeup. The three women worked together in comfortable harmony, sharing stories and laughter as they prepared for the ceremony. "Something old," Catherine said, presenting Claire with a vintage pearl necklace. It was Alexander's mother's. Mrs. Henderson found it in the family vault. Something new, Emma added, bringing out a delicate silver charm bracelet, matching the ones they all wore but with additional charms representing bread loaves and grape clusters. Claire hugged them both, careful not to wrinkle her elegant cream silk dress. How did I get so lucky to find not just a husband, but a whole family? I ask myself the same thing every day, Emma smiled, adjusting Claire's veil. The ceremony was everything they'd hoped for, intimate, joyful, and full of love. Alexander's voice shook slightly as he recited his vows, promising not just to love Claire, but to continue building their unique family together. Claire's response was steady and sure, her eyes shining as she pledged her life to both Alexander and the family they'd created. Catherine, serving as Claire's matron of honor, while Emma stood as her father's best woman, watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Her health had stabilized enough for her to walk down the aisle unassisted, though she kept her wheelchair nearby for when she tired. During the reception, Emma gave a toast that left hardly a dry eye in the gathering. A year ago, I came to Thornfield Hall as a stranger, carrying a secret and a silver bracelet. Today, I stand here surrounded by more love than I ever dreamed possible. To my father and Claire, may your love continue to grow like the finest vines, producing the sweetest vintage year after year. The educational center had already proven a success, with waiting lists for Claire's baking workshops and Catherine's art classes. Emma's sustainable farming programs had attracted attention from other vineyards across the country, and there were plans to expand the curriculum. As the evening progressed, Emma found a quiet moment with her mother, who was resting in a comfortable chair near the dance floor. "Happy?" Catherine asked, watching Alexander and Claire's first dance. "More than I ever imagined possible," Emma replied. "Are you?" "Perfectly," Catherine smiled, touching her silver bracelet. "You know, when I sent you here with this bracelet, I hoped Alexander would recognize it, but I never dreamed we'd end up here like this. Sometimes life gives us more than we dare to ask for." The celebration continued under the stars, with local wines flowing freely and Claire's wedding cake, a masterpiece of artisanal baking, drawing admiration from all the guests. Mrs. Henderson moved through the crowd with tears of joy in her eyes, having watched Thornfield Hall transform from a place of solitude to one filled with life and love. Later, as the party wound down, Emma found herself back in the vineyard where everything had begun. The summer air was heavy with the scent of ripening grapes, promising another exceptional harvest. From her vantage point, she could see the lights of the educational center, where tomorrow Catherine would teach another art class, and Claire would return from her honeymoon to continue sharing her family's baking traditions. Alexander found her there, Claire at his side. "Your mother's asking for you," he said. "She wants a family photograph before the photographer leaves." Emma looked at her father and his new wife, their happiness radiating in the summer twilight. "Did you ever imagine, when you interviewed me for the vineyard manager position, that we'd end up here?" "No," Alexander admitted, wrapping an arm around Claire. "But I'm grateful every day for that silver bracelet that brought you to us." They walked back to the reception together, where Catherine waited with Mrs. Henderson and the photographer. As they gathered for the photograph, Emma realized that this was what her mother had hoped for all along. Not just a reunion, but a rebirth. A chance for all of them to create something new and beautiful from the scattered pieces of the past. The camera flashed, capturing the moment forever. Alexander and Claire in their wedding finery. Catherine glowing with quiet joy, Emma between her parents, and Mrs. Henderson beaming proudly at the family she'd helped to nurture. Above them, the stars twinkled over Thornfield Hall, where a silver bracelet had led a daughter home, and love had transformed solitude into symphony.